Welcome to the Met. This is one of the great museums of the world. The Metropolitan Museum of Art has many exhibitions. The one that's been attracting attention since September 1994 and will run through January of 1995 is called Origins of Impressionism. We are pleased to give you a tour of some extraordinary artists. Our guide is the director of the Metropolitan. His name is Philippe de Montebello. He has been here as director since 1977, and I want to thank you for letting us do this. This is indeed an honor for me to be here, and thank you for taking us. This is about what? Help us understand what we're going to see on this tour.
Well, I think what you're going to see in coming to the show is how Impressionism was born, because we tend to accept today Impressionism. What we're providing is the context. Out of what is it born? Does it emerge fully formed and armed as Athena from the brow of Zeus? Or is there a moment of ferment? Is there a lot of interaction and struggle? And I think we'll find the latter. We have right here all of the Impressionists together, represented by Fantin-Latour in the studio of Monet, who was really the guiding light of them all. And Gary Tinterow, the curator of this exhibition, has organized it so that we come into the first room and see all of the academic painters. And why was there a reaction to the academic painters? You could be a great academic painter if you were in the 17th century Poussin, or in the earlier 19th century Ingres, who has a great sense of style. But there was clearly, by the middle of the century, a sense that it was a tired set of movements and tired old repetitions of the same mythologies and religious pictures. And there was somehow a need that coalesced at that moment for something new.
In this room is something called the Salon of 1859. What does that represent? I mean, is that a beginning point for this sort of decade that ends?
I think it's a good beginning point, because it's really the one salon, the picture the exhibition put together by the French government at the time, where all of the young artists, many are teenagers, Monet is 18, see for the first time the kind of painting that is available and is being done all over France. And they just find it boring, and they find it repetitious and hackneyed. And they're bursting with energy and vision, and they want something new.
And coming out of the decade in 1870 is a clear sense that a new era of painting is dawning.
That is true. Going through this show, ending up in the last gallery, one suddenly realizes that the road is open for post-impressionism, for cubism, for abstract expressionism, that the world is suddenly opened.
One thing about the organization of this exhibit, we will be going from room to room to room, but it's organized differently. It is not chronological. Why did you do it this way?
We wanted to show the artists together, painting the same subjects. So we grouped together the still lives, the figures in the landscapes, the portrait, the landscapes themselves, because that's the best way in which you can see, since the subjects are the same, how close together were these artists, but also the divergences in their styles. Whereas if you had a landscape chronologically next to a still life, it's much harder to make those comparisons. It's a choice. You could have done it any number of ways. We thought this was the most effective.
Okay. We will now take you on a tour. We will go from room to room to room. We will see, over the period of this decade, Manet and Degas and Monet and Cézanne, and we will also see Renoir. I may be leaving some out. But as we go from room to room to room and look at the different classifications, we will reflect on this extraordinary period in which the beginnings, the origins of Impressionism were there in Paris in 1860. Tell me about this room.
Well, what we've done here is to put together a group of pictures painted essentially by those who will be the new Impressionists, the artists of the new painting, of figures in a landscape, which was something very new, because in the old days, the academic painters and so forth, figures in a landscape tended to be mythological figures, figures from the Bible. But part of the novelty of this is that the artists are looking at daily life, and they are painting their families and Parisians on an outing.
And here?
And here you have one of the most ambitious paintings done by Monet. It's on loan to us from our partner in this show, which is the Musée d'Orsay in Paris, of a very large canvas that he meant to show at the Salon. The Salon is the annual exhibition that the French government would hold, and often 2,000 to 3,000 to 4,000 pictures by the practicing artists were brought together. And it was really the way to be known. And Monet painted this very large painting. They needed to be large because if they were small, they were not noticed with so many pictures in the show. Also, it's a measure of one's ambition. But of...
a measure of the artist's ambition, how big his pictures should be?
Well, to a large extent, yes. The bigger, the more noticed. Also, it's more difficult. Yeah. You really have to have a very careful composition before you can dare to have it on such a large scale. The figures are literally life-size. And what he's done here is to represent these ladies, and the one with the parasol, in a fairly formal garden. But the novelty of it, first of all, is that they're not figures from mythology, but figures from everyday life, and that he paints them out of doors. This is the first element, really, towards Impressionism, actually painting the whole picture, not just the sketch for it, which they would often do. Even Corot would paint his sketches out of doors, but then he'd go to the studio and then finish the picture. But there, Monet actually planted his easel and the canvas out of doors to paint this picture. And because of the size of the painting, if you stand in front of it, even if it's on the ground, Monet couldn't reach the top and do the sky and do the leaves. He actually dug himself with a shovel a trench. Yeah. And as he moved up to paint the leaves, the picture came down into the trench. So he was at all times outdoors painting the picture.
And why is it that before Impressionism, painters did not paint out of doors?
Because painting was much more thought of as a cerebral, academic exercise. It was simply the norm that you did not need really to do more than observe either the model in the studio or occasionally sketch out of doors. Claude Lorrain in the 17th century, we know, went and made a lot of sketches out of doors. But the finished picture was done according to fairly conventional rules. Here, what the artist wanted to do in the middle of the 19th century is break with all rules and really bring everything about daily life. And that meant the changing light caused by the sun or the rain or the clouds.
Real people.
Real people, real light, which is why these pictures are so much more keyed up when you compare them to old masters or even to the academic painters of the 19th century. This is much, much brighter painting. A lot of blacks and browns have been dropped. Another thing that really makes a great step forward is that the modulations and the halftones moving from the shadows to the lights is no longer gradual. It had to be gradual for a good, careful painting before that. Here you've got really almost like enormous spots of color, zones of just pure color set side by side. And that was thought to be, and was, absolutely revolutionary at the time.
What else should we take note of in this room?
In this room, well, there's a whole group of pictures painted out of doors, but what is interesting is how different they are one from the other, even though they're all painted within a 4 to 5 year period. One of the original things that we did in this exhibition is to group pictures by subject matter. Yes. And one of the reasons we did this is so that one could see when Renoir was painting.
How does he compare with another
exactly,
artist?
How they are either very close to each other, because you have to, or very different from each other, because you have to remember that these are a group of artists who know each other, who work together. They often paint the same subject.
Even responded to each other in terms of painting and counterpainting, call and response.
They did that with some degree of collegiality, but occasionally some degree of competition. But to see Monet in 1865 or 66 next to a Renoir of just 5 years later shows you just the tremendous strides that were made also in the development towards the pure Impressionist style.
Do you lose anything by grouping in these kinds of genre categories? It gives you the opportunity to compare artists of the same time and see what they thought and how they were painting because they knew each other and related to each other and had conversations about art. But is anything lost in that process? Rather than seeing a chronological element.
I was about to say, what is lost is the sense of chronology. Yeah. But in every exhibition, you have to make choices. And we could have had all of the paintings by one artist in one room, or mix them as we did here within the same genre, or have it done entirely chronologically. We could also have had the academic paintings against which these painters react hung side by side all along the way, so that you would be constantly reminded of the contrast. We chose in this instance to put them all in the first room and not to disturb from the great explosion.
To remind you what Impressionism and the origins of Impressionism was reacting to.
Exactly.
Let's take a look at a
one
Renoir.
right here.
Yeah. What do we see?
Well, we see two pictures, each very different from the other. They're 2 years apart. The one on the left with the single figure in front of the landscape. And my phraseology explains the difference between these two. This is a figure in front of a landscape. These are figures in a landscape. Yeah. And one of the great achievements of Impressionism, and it's not just Renoir, Monet also a few years after the picture we've just seen, is they treat the figure, in a sense, as if it were a tree or a cloud or the ground. Yeah. There is an object. It's the whole thing, bathed in daylight. It's the reflections of light as it strikes object. There's nothing anecdotal, there is no storytelling. It's simply looking through the temperament of Renoir at really things seen, the reflections of light. And the great advance of a picture such as this, of those two figures in the landscape, over the large Monet that we've looked at before, which is about painted 4 years before, is how much more integrated into the landscape are the figures, and how the light is now achieved through a multiplicity of those little flecks of brushstrokes. And this is a device they use to lead you more into a sense of reality, of the shifting quality of the light, the sun at all times moving, the wind making the leaves flutter. There is something rather more still and staged in the big painting that we just saw by Monet instead.
Now this one.
This one is the more conservative Renoir. He's looking back at Courbet. Courbet and Manet are the two great heroes, of course, of this story, the generation just before. And he hasn't yet learned or really figured out quite how to deal with the human figure out of doors. The chances are this is painted in the studio, whereas the other picture is clearly painted.
So this represented, in a sense, the older way of doing it.
It does. I mean, they are learning, they're studying. You can't achieve the greatness as an impressionist, as a modern painter, unless you have all of the techniques behind you, unless you know how to paint the human figure, unless you're a great draftsman and colorist and so forth. So you're looking at a period, one of the things about this exhibition that is so poignant in a way is that one is looking at the struggle of the artist. Had we done a show of the 1870s or 80s, everything would have been comfortable. These artists would have been merely improving upon themselves. They would already have found their style. These are artists struggling to gain something and to find something.
The 60s was, the 1860 to 1870 or thereabouts was the time that they were, in a sense, going through this evolution themselves, not quite knowing where it was going, but beginning to feel the sense of being outdoors, the use of color and light in a much more dramatic way.
That's exactly it, and you have to wait till the 70s, in fact the exhibition of 1874, before even the word Impressionism is used about them.
So this is what room?
Well, this is a room devoted to still life. Yes. We have to remember that plein air painting, painting out of doors, carries with it one element of risk. It does occasionally rain.
Yes.
And in fact, a lot of them painted in Normandy, where it rains a fair amount. And when it rains, you paint portraits, or you paint, as you see here, a still life. Right. This still life is by...
So you go inside when it rains?
You go inside. There is also, of course, a long tradition of painting still lives in the history of art, because it allows you to organize the objects so that you're doing paintings twice. You're really painting first by moving objects on the table, imitating either a table that is set for lunch or vase of flowers on it, or in the case of Cézanne in this picture, a table set really for nothing except a work of art, because we're not about to have breakfast, we're not about to eat the seashell or its contents, and there's a clock.
We're about to paint a picture.
Yeah, we're about to paint a picture, and that's true. That's really very much what modern art is about. The main subject of the picture is objects busy being in a painting. And this is one of the first great masterpieces of the young Cézanne. This is done in 1870.
What makes it a masterpiece?
I would say probably first and foremost the fact that neither you nor I can articulate it. There is something that just touches us, makes us realize we're in the presence of something unforgettable and important. We can't quite pin it down. And if you can start really to be able to decorticate a picture, to peel it leaf by leaf as an onion, you're dealing with a fairly ordinary work.
Less than a master.
Yeah. Here you've got Cézanne making an extraordinarily classical composition, all in horizontals and verticals, although he was by far the most provocative, the most outrageous of the young Impressionists. In fact, they all desperately wanted to show at the Salon, at the official government-sponsored exhibition. But this is a man, Cézanne, who would have been absolutely broken apart had he ever been accepted. I mean, he wanted to throw mud in the head.
So he was of the avant-garde of his time.
Totally avant-garde, much more than the others.
Yeah. And what...
Here he uses a palette knife, a very thick paint. And that is a significant thing in terms of the development of modern art, because it means that he is focusing your eye, our eye, on the surface of the canvas itself. He's saying, I'm painting a picture. I'm not trying to make you believe that you've got just a tablecloth and a cup. This is really a painting of a tablecloth. You see the brushstroke and the paint is there thickly. Courbet did this. They learned this from Courbet, who uses palette knife. And this came to be associated as flaunting the establishment.
It is said that Monet is the hero. You would characterize him as the hero of this exhibit. Was he also the hero of the period, or was Cézanne? I mean, who was the leader among this group of painters, Renoir and Cézanne and Monet and Manet?
The leader was clearly Manet. First of all, they're all, they're teenagers. They're 18, 19, 20. Cézanne is the youngest of them all, much too young. He's certainly not a leader. Manet, on the other hand, is already a mature painter. And Manet, unlike Monet and Pissarro, Renoir, Cézanne, and so forth, has much more of a political agenda. Manet really wants to fight the establishment, not just to find a new way of painting, a more modern way of painting. The others, following Manet, see the visual advances that he makes in his
it's
pictures.
Art for the rest of them, it's art, but for Manet, it's politics, and also he has a social agenda.
That's right. Manet and Courbet have a stronger social agenda than these others.
All right. What shall we see next? They're over here. There is a...
Well, here we have a Monet and a Renoir side by side.
Again, the value of this exhibit, because you can see how both of them, one in 1869, same painting, 1869, same year.
And same vase.
And same vase.
Oh,
the same, yes.
They did it at the same time. And as you were remarking earlier, they were all friends and they worked together. And what's fascinating here is that they're painting the same flowers in the same vase with the same fruit, probably within a day or two apart.
But the flowers are different in terms of the way they're placed in arrangement, right?
But there, in fact, what one sees is a moment in the late 1860s where Monet and Renoir, Monet is the larger picture here, are very close in the way they paint. They're looking over each other's shoulder. They're, as I mentioned earlier, they're learning. They're developing a new style. And so it's not just competition, but, gee, oh, yes, you're right. You're using this tone, this color. You're using a lot of little brush strokes. I think I'll do the same. And so here it's almost indistinguishable which is which. There's something a little grander about the Monet. The contrasts are tougher, because Monet is a tougher artist than Renoir. Wherever you see Monet and Renoir, what's interesting is the two, there's something always a little more, well, I wouldn't say so much it's effeminate, but a little more tender, delicate, and I think less bold in Renoir. Monet, much more virile, much more interesting in contrasts.
Yeah, you can see it here clearly.
Yeah.
Where did these paintings come from, these two? Where were they, just to take one example?
Well, the one on the right comes from the Getty Museum. The one on the left is from the Boston Museum. The two biggest lenders to show are ourselves, with more than 20 pictures, the Musée d'Orsay with more than 20, with the two organizers. And I guess it's divided 1/3, 2/3 among private collections and museums, but museums all over the world.
Yeah.
The Cézanne we looked at a moment ago was the still life is from a private collection.
Yeah. And is it easy to get collectors to give up their paintings for an exhibition?
One of the toughest things about organizing an exhibition is not so much the guiding intelligence and the organization behind it, but it is frankly cajoling and luring pictures away from both collectors and museums. Museums don't like to take a major picture of their walls. Sometimes you have to lend a picture in return. It increases the cost. Right, sure, there. Absolutely. And private collectors often don't have a storeroom. And so if it's the main picture in the dining room or over the sofa, they can be very hesitant.
As we go from one still life room to another still life room, you mentioned that Basile kept the others, what?
Well, he kept them alive, bought their pictures, gave them a little money. He was the only one who came from a relatively wealthy family, and the others were poorest church mice. Yeah. And here, in fact, you have an absolutely perfect example of those artists working closely together. You have three painters representing. You have Basile painting still life of herons. You have a painting by Renoir of Basile painting this very picture. And then to the left, you have Alfred Sisley, another one of the Impressionists, painting in the same studio at the same time, the same heron and the little partridges or whatever they are on the cloth. So there you have it.
Once
and they're
again,
painting in Basile's studio.
Has there been a time in the history of art where so many eventually widely regarded and well-known artists were together at one point, at one time, in one city?
I think probably the closest parallel to France in the 19th century until the First World War as really the Mecca for artists who felt they were nowhere unless they were there would have been Rome in the 16th and 17th century. Everybody had to go to Rome, and you know the Grand Tour later on.
It was the center, and it was where everything else revolved around.
That's right.
Let's go over to the full-length portraiture here, and we stop here at, what do we see? Well,
we see basically a street singer.
Another Monet.
Another Monet, a great Monet from the Boston Museum. And what is startling about this picture, and it's hard to say startling, one stands in front of a picture like this and one simply admires it today, because we don't come with all of the baggage that people at the time would have. But first, the format. This is a large picture. It is a full-length painting, and it is a format that was reserved in the 19th century to portraits of the Empress Eugénie, to kings and queens and nobility and great people. And to have painted a simple street singer, a girl from the streets, with that format was felt to be outrageous and insulting to the dignity of other people.
To the dignity of all that had come before.
Of all that, absolutely. This is in fact the same sitter as in the great Olympia of Manet, and he keeps repeating it. Also, what was shocking is that this was a recognizable figure, someone that they knew was a kind of a demi-mondaine, but pictorially it's one of the wonderful pictures in the show.
Whatever the word is, if it would be a writer, it would be prolific. Were most of these artists prolific? Were they painting all the time and constantly producing?
Yes, they were.
After painting after painting?
Yes, they were. Okay.
Also in this room is a startling example, looking at two paintings, of what this exhibit is about. Tell me what.
Well, that's true. You have the old, and you have the new, in a sense. This painting of Carolus Durand, a large, full-length portrait of a lady of a certain social standing, removing her white glove from her hand, in a black dress, in a simple interior, with all of the light focused, as was traditionally done, whether it was Van Dyck or the English portrait painters, on the key things of a portrait that please the sitter, the face and the hands, and then the rest in a kind of shadow, and the figure nice and centralized in the canvas. And then one turns here to something totally different, where all of a sudden the dark tones are gone. Also a portrait of a lady dressed in fashionable clothes. But what is startling here is that the light doesn't just illumine the hands or the face, but everything in the picture. And there's as much attention drawn to the flowers on the carpet as the flowers on the table, as the shawl around her waist. In fact, Monet, this is by Monet, this was by Carolus Durand, Monet is so intent on showing you a Parisian lady occupying a space, and that everything about the space is equally important, that he has his sitter, or should I say stander, turn away from you
Yes.
How often do you find someone pictured actually looking away from the painter? I mean, that is bold. And in the end, what you look at is an overall picture. You turn to the Carolus Durand, and instantly you see the face and you see the hands. The rest is inconsequential.
When this was taking place, did those people who write about art take note? Was it an object of discussion and controversy in the press about painting of the time?
Yes, and this style was then derided.
Yes.
People felt that it was, they didn't understand it. They said, well, this is not how you paint a portrait, and you haven't paid attention to the face, and your brushstrokes are too visible. You don't give the illusion of reality. It's just a lot of gobs of paint on the canvas.
As you say, the word Impressionism in the beginning was a word of derision rather than a word of admiration. And it was also true, as you said, about Baroque and...
Baroque or Gothic.
Yes.
Gothic was a term that was meant, in opposition to classical, the architecture of the Goths, the people in the north.
Yes. And what do we have here? This is another example
here
of...
we have one of the great icons of French painting, in a sense, the fifer, the boy playing the fife. And this was immediately recognizable because we sense that it's a fabulous picture where all of the attention is really devoted to the boy against a simple background, just the action of playing the fife, the bright colors, the zones of black and red and yellow. But at the time it was criticized for its flatness. A flatness that was deliberate on the part of Manet. The flatter you are, the closer to the canvas you are, the more, as an artist, you assert yourself, the more modern you are, and you move towards contemporary painting that is very flat. But also they criticize it looking like, they said, well, where are the other figures in this deck of cards? The picture next to it, we've hung next to it because it's by a student of Manet, and we have it there in a sense to show the difference in quality between genius and mere talent. And I think it's very obvious that you've got on the left a very timid, slightly conservative approach to the subject, and on the right an artist who is really making a statement, breaking new ground.
When you use that phrase, genius rather than talent, it reminds me, as part of the lore about you, your father said once to you, you thought about being a painter? You aspired to be a painter?
I wanted to be a painter, yeah. It did.
And your father said?
My father said, who himself had been a painter early in his life and an art critic before doing a lot of other things, kept looking at my things and said, you've got maybe a little talent, but you have no genius, and therefore you really should do something else. I've been eternally grateful to him since.
Because it enabled you to what?
Well, it made me mad at the time.
Yeah.
But this was a generation when children obeyed their parents. Yeah. So I did what he wanted, and I studied history of art instead.
All right, let's go to our next room. We're now entering what room?
We're entering a room of landscapes.
All right. At long last, landscapes.
Long last, the Impressionist show and no landscapes.
Exactly. And we'll see first here.
And we see first, not a sunlit landscape, but a stormy, cold day in the Jura, the mountains east of France, done by Courbet, of a number of figures in the snow. And I mentioned earlier that both Courbet and Manet had, in a sense, social agendas as well as visual, aesthetic agendas. And
Courbet preceded Manet.
You have the great figure of Courbet comes first, and the next leader is Manet, and then you move on to the Impressionists. And what we see here is a marvelous landscape in the snow, and it feels cold and rather desolate. And it's peopled with a goat and a old lady carrying wood and a little child carrying bread. And you would think this is simply, peasants coming back home and so forth. But it isn't. This was painted at a time when some critical human rights were denied by the government to the peasants, one of which was the right of their goats to graze on communal ground, the other of people to pick up firewood on communal ground, and the other is to bake your bread on communal ground.
So we see the political statement.
This is a political statement, but in wonderfully pictorial terms. Yeah. And it's interesting to contrast it with the work of Claude Monet, which to me is just one of the great masterpieces of the 19th century. And really this picture
is one of the great masterpieces to you
yes.
of the 19th century.
Should I declare that it is so? Because it is, well, it really, why? Let me put it another way. This and the great Bruegel of the hunters in the snow in Vienna are the two great paintings of snow. First, because they're the ones that once one has experienced and been moved in front of them, one absolutely cannot eradicate them from one's memory. Because you stand in front of this picture and you're no longer so much aware that you're in front of a picture, but in front of cold, of wet, of heavy snow, of an artist having really captured something of the essence. It becomes irrelevant in what village it is, whether it's in Germany, in France, or in Sweden. This is in a sense, the quintessential, the day after the snow scene with the sun streaming and hitting the ground. And looking closely at this picture, it's astonishing how unwhite is the snow, how the entire foreground is speckled with any number of colors, the reflections of the range of colors of the sun against the snow, how the shadows are very blue. The Impressionists understood this. In the Courbet we saw before, they're already much grayer. It's gray and white. And here just how warm the whole thing is, and just how he's captured it all simply with paint on a brush on a canvas. The magpie, the little bird with its black beak sitting on the fence off center. There's a kind of a dynamism about this picture, way in which the light strikes it, that makes us awestruck.
We should make a note here is that there are other Impressionist, a lot of paintings here will reflect the great Impressionist painters, and you can come to this museum.
This show closes on the 8th of January, but more than 150 Impressionists are in our galleries at all time. So if that picture isn't here, a lot of others along the lines are too.
Do you as the director of this museum, have a favorite?
As the director of this museum, I would be very careful not to tell you that I have a favorite. But I can explain myself on this one because we don't own it. It's an Orsay, and I don't.
But as a student of art, do you have a favorite?
I'll tell you. I'll give you an honest answer, and it's not flippant. It changes from day to day. It changes according to mood. There are days when I would want a brightly lit picture. There are days when I would want to stand in front of a dark and brooding Rembrandt self-portrait. There are days when I want to look at the craftsmanship of a Shan dynasty bronze. It's like music. There are moments when I want to listen to nothing but Bach, and I'll put on the Goldberg variations time and again in my car. At times when I want to suddenly switch to Chopin, do something totally different. So, hard to say.
What hangs in your office?
Oh, I would not deny the public anything that grand. I have a mediocre Claude, and I have a Panini view of Rome.
All right.
But I have posters and things. But I do change them around.
Let's go to our next and final room.
We could stop for 1 second in front of the Terrasse de Sainte-Adresse. One of the great influences on the Impressionists was the discovery, mid-century, of Japanese prints. In the 19th century, Chinese, Japanese, all of that meant the Orient. They weren't being very scholarly about it, and what he really meant was Japanese. And in fact, others who looked at it said, this is a Japanese picture. In fact, the broad planes of color, the kind of a perspective that rises up the canvas more than it goes in depth, owes a lot to the prints of Hokusai and the other great printmakers in Japan in the 19th century. And Monet himself collected Japanese prints and were fascinated by their simplicity and their high-pitched color. And this is an example of an adaptation, in a very vague, subliminal way almost, of the imagery of the Japanese onto a French landscape, a landscape that is just on the cusp of being Impressionist, still very broadly, thickly painted. Look at the wonderful white parasol of the lady in the foreground, and the sharpness and crispness with which things are done.
We are beginning to see here, and correct me I may be wrong, but we're beginning to see here, among all the things that we have seen, something that I think most of us would say begins to take on the form, because of color, of what we think of as Impressionism.
You're right. They are using pure colors out of the tubes, leaving aside all of the darker tones that were associated with academic painting and the old masters.
Look at the flag.
Yeah,
and the green and the flowers
painted
on the
from
right.
nature. They just wanted to go straight from the notion. You want to smell the briny air, feel and sense the wind moving those flags, the light of the sun beating down on the landscape, on the hats, on the parasol, on the chairs, the shadows, the ground, a kind of an overall sense of the reflections of light. That's really what they are painting.
Did Monet, in a sense, provide, someone wrote about this, and they were talking about the exhibit, and they said somehow, what did Monet do for Monet? For Monet
No.
do for Claude Monet?
Well, Monet was the father figure.
Right.
He was really the impetus. He's the man who dares first, and the others then pick up on that. What is interesting is the twist, that as you move into the late 60s and early 70s, Monet begins to look at Monet.
Yes.
And he then lightens up his palette even more and starts to paint more as an impressionist.
Got you. Let's go into the next room and we'll see our final series of paintings. The room is called, I guess, Modern Life. And
Devoted to the painters who look at modern life, which is one of the things that they do.
what do we see over here as we move
Well, what
over
we
to
see-
our final sort of collection here?
Well, it's the coda,
Yes.
in a sense. This is pictures from 1870, from the last year, 69-70 of the show. Again, while they are landscapes, they are painters painting modern life, a place where Parisians went to the countryside to enjoy themselves. And both Monet and Renoir come and sit side by side and paint the water, the reflections on the water, and the people amusing themselves. And in the paintings by Renoir, there is a greater concentration on the greater concentration on the figures themselves, and greater integration of the figures into the landscape. With Monet, was always much less interested in the anecdote. Renoir, in fact, over his entire career, becomes much more of a painter of figures in a sense than of landscape.
And Monet is doing what? He's more interested in the landscape itself than in the characters and the personality, the faces, the feelings.
Everything is painted with the same brushstrokes, very broad, very strong. And what is, in fact, interesting, these are sketches towards what was a much larger picture. We look at them today as finished and wonderful pictures, but there was a much bigger painting than this, in which he combined all of these sketches, which was lost, in fact, destroyed during the Second World War.
This is sort of the end. I'd love to sit down with you and
let's
talk
do
about
that.
some other things in addition, because you have noted this whole thing is about art and the origins of Impressionism. Impressionism, in a sense, comes full flower when?
We're almost there with the series of La Grenouillère. The term itself, of course, starts in 1874. I would say the decade of the 70s. And I think most of the pictures everybody would recognize immediately as Impressionists were done probably in the 1880s. And then what you have is the artist beginning to diverge and go in different routes. Cézanne becoming something very different. Degas continuing to do what he has always done, in a sense, never really joining the movement. And then you've got the others, Pissarro, Sisley, and so forth. And even in Impressionism, you find in the later years even a formulaistic quality, where it becomes a system, and then it needs to break out and do something else, and then you've got Cubism, preceded by Fauvism and other things later on. All of these isms.
What does Impressionism mean for you? What does it represent?
It's a first great stride towards modernity. It's the first moment when the art of painting really breaks out of all of the conventions of the past. Conventions that certainly didn't stop Leonardo or Raphael or Titian Velázquez from being great painters. They were great painters within a whole set of conventions. It's the first time, in a sense, that painting becomes anarchistic. Anarchy, there are no more limits. It allows then for Cubism, for Dadaism, for
and
all
you
of the
see it in the color, you see it in the lines, and you see it in
the fact that there are no holes barred.
Yeah, that is.
Then the painters can go in any direction in which they want. All color, all brushstrokes, any subject is permissible, whether it's a nude in a landscape with dressed gentlemen, as with Manet, or just simply pure landscape.
You are the director of this museum. Tell me about the Met and what it represents and what it ought to do and what ought to be its mission.
Oh, you want this in 30 seconds?
Yeah, I want the brief version.
The Met is with the Louvre and with the Hermitage in St. Petersburg, Russia. They are the three largest museums in the world, probably in the order Louvre, Metropolitan, Hermitage. But the Met is different from the others, that it is the only one that is a true, total encyclopedia of the art of the world over 5,000 years in the entire continent under one roof. The Louvre, if you want to see Asian art, you won't find it there. You have to go to a separate museum in Paris. If you want to see arms and armor, you have to go to the Musée de l'Armée. The same thing in London with its three great museums, the Victoria and Albert, the British Museum, and the National Gallery. Three separate institutions. Here, under one roof, you have the arts of all of the world represented at a very high level of quality, and that is unique.
Yeah, I want to come back to what you're doing here at the Met, because this exhibition ends on January 8th, but you've got a lot of Impressionism here, represented here.
Finest collection outside of Paris.
The finest collection, I assume, is where?
In Paris.
But is it at the Louvre or is it at?
No, it's at the Musée d'Orsay.
Which is the
Used
code.
to be at the,
which is the code. With this, in fact, this exhibit began there.
Yes.
Hermitage in St. Petersburg.
Right.
They just discovered.
Or at least revealed.
They revealed. They discovered 92, so they say. Well, we don't know. But what did they find, and what's the significance of it in terms of works of Impressionist painters, including some of those here, including Van Gogh?
What they found, the significance of their find, which is several dozen very fine Impressionists and post-Impressionists. Everything
several
from
dozen?
Apparently it's several dozen, 40 to 50 pictures.
And how did they get there, do we think?
I know what I read in the press, and I've spoken to the director of the Hermitage and the curator.
Here's the conversation. When can I get those paintings here?
The day after it came out, you took the words out of my mouth. Literally, the director of the Hermitage happened to be in New York the day the article broke in the New York Times. I had lunch with him, and the first question was, if ever those pictures were to leave Russia for an exhibition, I'd like to be on record as being the first museum requested it, which he took note of. In fact, the next day, we had a corporate sponsor call up. I suspect the litigation, the threat of seizure and so forth is going to be such that it'll be months and years before that
threat of seizure comes from the fact that these paintings were stolen from private homes, I guess, or museums, or we don't know where, and then somehow they went from the Germans to the Russians.
Some public institutions, some private, some families with heirs, some without.
Paintings that we have never seen before, perhaps?
Paintings that certainly have not been seen really since before the Second World War. You're talking now half a century. And which we thought were lost, and some very great pictures among them.
Yeah, I bet you can't wait to get to Moscow to see them.
Huh? To St. Petersburg, and
I'm sorry, to St. Petersburg.
I'll be there in May, and the show will be up.
All right. I said this ends here. You've got a de Kooning coming up, which was at the National Gallery, which I saw.
Yeah.
Now, when an exhibit goes from one museum to another, do you change it? Do you set it in a different way? I mean,
essentially, the choice of pictures is the same.
Yeah.
You owe that as just respect for the curatorial expertise that puts into it. But our galleries are different shapes, different configuration, and our curator installs them, often with somewhat of a different optic.
I want to get to that point. So what difference does a curator make? I mean, how can you make it, with all respect for the National Gallery, which I love, how can you make it better? What does a curator bring to the table?
I'm glad you said better. I would have said different. But I don't
take
quarrel, not at all.
Yes.
Well, we bring to the table first the experience of having seen it in the first place.
Right.
And
that may be an advantage to be second.
It often is. Then you can say, well, these two don't work together, or this configuration, if we gave more space to this group, so we've given it more space, its area And the way in which Nan Rosenthal, our curator here, installed it, I think is, well, there's a certain coherence to it that I think perhaps was, it's different at least from what was in the National Gallery.
You also have here an exhibit of, I think, early Renaissance Florentine.
An absolutely wonderful and unique exhibition
Obviously, I haven't seen it.
Yeah, Renaissance art of Florence, with a whole group of pictures by Fra Angelico.
Yeah.
I mean, there simply are no exhibitions of Renaissance painting anymore because most of them are on panel, and museums are hesitant to lend works of art on panel, that is on wood, because they tend to suffer more in fluctuations of humidity, different museums in different climates. But we've achieved more than 100 works from Florence, which is incredible.
Finally, there's not in this conversation, but finally in terms of exhibits that I know about, you've got this thing which is, I'm calling Greek jewelry.
Greek jewelry,
Greek
was gold of the 5th and 4th
Greece,
century. Yep.
And
this is a show, you spoke of St. Petersburg before. This is an exhibition drawn entirely of the holdings of the British Museum in London, of ours, and of the Hermitage in St. Petersburg, which are the three strongest collections of Greek gold of the 5th and 4th century BC. Absolutely astounding work, and an exhibition, both that and the Renaissance show, are on through March.
in a world of art, you'll know more about this than I do, Bill Gates, the billionaire owner of Microsoft and chief executive officer, is buying up what? The rights to great pieces of art so that he can put them on digital?
Well, he's trying to. The thing is that I think a lot of museums are resisting this for the moment because of the matter of control, not only of the rights and the potential profits and revenue source of having your own images available for the internets and the world out there through digitalized images that would last for a long, long time, but also resisting selling those rights because we feel very strongly about the proper content of works of art. If too many images go out and we lose control over them, they can be used in advertisements, they can be used in very shoddy and inaccurate ways, and we have a responsibility to truth. And we feel very strongly that works of art, as the greatest manifestation of the creative mankind at the highest level of its perception and vision, should have a context that is serious, that is accurate and scholarly.
Like museums.
Well, like museums, and that museums have an opportunity themselves to formulate the programs and to so organize the diffusion of those works on the outside that I think it serves a greater purpose than to be simply in the for-profit world and uncontrolled.
Is there a threat to how are we doing in terms of museums? I'm not sure whether there's a question here somewhere, but basically, are museums in good health for the most part in the United States?
I would say certainly if you judge by attendance, they've never been higher. In fact, attendance has gone down slightly in the performing arts, has not in the museums here. We have the luxury, as we're filming this, to be in an empty gallery, but this show has been seen in less than 3 months by close to 600,000 visitors. And that's not just all the visitors to the Met, we've had many more. So certainly we provide a service, an atmosphere, an ambiance that clearly the public clamors for and finds, and I would say on the whole that museums are healthy.
What do you love most about your job? I mean, here at this great place that you've considered one of the 3 great museums.
I serve geniuses of all time. I feel as if I wear somehow the instrument of greatness, and so I feel a sense by proxy of doing something useful for mankind. It's somewhat messianistic, but why not?
Yeah. And why not? And how long can you do this?
Well, I've been director now for 17 years, and well, I still feel excited about what I'm doing. There's absolutely, I think so. I mean, there's a lot still to be done. I've got many projects. I'd like to see a few of them accomplished by myself.
And you're now planning works and exhibits through
1997, 98. And major reinstallations, such as our Greek and Roman collections, and a lot of things that need to be done.
And when you go out and make a speech, as I know you're doing early next year, about the philosophy of museums, what's the cogent point you try to make?
Well, the cogent point for me, at least in large encyclopedic museums such as the Metropolitan, is that we should stay at arm's length from the swings of political fashion, that we represent a sense of permanence and history, that the integrity of the work of art is our raison d'être, and that is really what we must follow as our credo, and that in many ways the services that we provide, the ambiance and the nature of the museum as it is today, is one that is threatened on all sides by increased commercialization, by a kind of a theme park mentality of amusement and entertainment over seriousness. And I think the role of museums, paradoxically, and this is not a conservative view, is that they ought not to change for the sake of change, and maybe focusing on that which they do well and keeping that sacred may be one of the great challenges of the future. In a sense, how do you stay the same? How to reverse our difficult world and maintain its strength?
Well, to come here, you get a sense of how an institution can be reflective of the evolution of a civilization. I thank you for this tour.
It's been a great pleasure
to introduce us to some of the geniuses that are reflected on these walls and in other places in this museum. Philippe, thank you very much.
Thanks for the opportunity. It's been great fun.
We thank you for joining us this evening. We look forward to seeing you again on Monday. See you then.